What would you do if you saw a little girl, drenched and trembling, standing all alone in the middle of a violent storm late at night? And what if that girl wasn't just any ordinary child, but someone being hunted by her own powerful family? Get ready because the secret you're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about kindness, love, and the truth. Don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment below if you believe that sometimes a single act of kindness can change the fate of many lives. The story begins now. The small coastal town of Grayshore was drowning in a violent storm. Rain lashed the streets like whips, turning every familiar corner into a freezing river of water. Daniel Pierce gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes straining to see through the blinding sheets of rain. He knew that somewhere just ahead, the little house by the harbor was waiting, the one with the porch where his son Ryan always stood waving every afternoon. But tonight, what was waiting for Daniel wasn't that familiar scene. Through the dim, flickering glow of the storm-battered streetlights, a small figure emerged, fragile, shivering, like a lone sprout caught in the heart of a raging wind. Daniel's chest tightened the moment he saw her. A little girl, soaked to the bone, alone, terrified. Without hesitation, he slammed the brakes. The car slid slightly before coming to a halt by the curb. She looked up at him, wide eyes filled with something between fear and a silent, desperate plea for help. Daniel rushed out. The rain struck his face like ice, but he barely noticed. In that moment, one thing consumed his entire being. This child needed help. "Are you out here alone?" he asked gently, trying to steady his voice despite the worry flooding through him. She didn't answer. Her lips were pale and trembling, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around her own body, as if trying to trap whatever warmth she had left. Daniel shrugged off his coat and quickly wrapped it around her, then pulled her into his arms. The second she leaned into him, quietly like a silent thank you, he felt something shift inside. In that single fragile moment, Daniel knew their already difficult life was about to change forever. He never imagined that one small act of kindness would become the beginning of a journey filled with challenges, unexpected love, and secrets waiting to surface from the storm. Daniel Pierce never imagined that his modest little home near the Grayshore Harbor would become a refuge for another child who needed his protection. As he gently laid Isabella Lane onto the worn-out sofa, a strange, stirring feeling rose in his chest. The small girl before him looked as if she had just escaped a nightmare. Her body still trembling, even though the house was now sealed tight against the wind and filled with warmth. Ryan Mercer stood nearby, his wide eyes brimming with curiosity, but also a deep, unspoken empathy that only a child could truly feel. Daniel reached out and softly brushed the soaked hair from Isabella's forehead, whispering gently, "You're safe now. Everything's going to be okay." His voice carried more than reassurance. It was a quiet battle against the lingering fear still flickering in her gaze. Isabella looked up at him, and the suspicion in her eyes slowly gave way to the faintest glimmer of fragile trust. But just when Daniel thought the worst was over, something shifted. Isabella's eyes widened in panic, and she gripped his sleeve with trembling hands. Her voice came out in a whisper so raw and terrified, it made his heart nearly stop. They're going to come looking for me. I can't go back home." Those words shattered the fragile peace that had just begun to bloom inside that tiny room. Questions erupted in Daniel's mind like thunder. Who were they? What had she been running from? And why was she so afraid? Deep down, something told him this little girl wasn't just lost. Behind those innocent eyes, a far bigger secret was hiding, one that could change everything. He knelt down to meet her gaze, steady and gentle. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he said softly. "You have my word." Daniel had no idea that this simple promise would become the first step into a whirlwind of danger, emotion, and discovery. A fight not just to protect Isabella, but to reclaim life, love, and the hope that had long since slipped away from him. Isabella sat curled up beside the small fireplace, the orange-yellow glow flickering across her pale face. Her eyes still held a deep fear, darting occasionally toward the window as if expecting something terrible to arrive at any moment. Daniel quietly pulled a chair closer, trying to bridge the invisible distance between them. His voice was gentle, steady, laced with patience as he asked, "Isabella, Do you remember anything about your parents or your family?" She looked up at him, her eyes glassy and suddenly brimming with tears. Slowly, she shook her head. The helplessness on that small, fragile face squeezed Daniel's heart. A child this young shouldn't have to carry a fear this heavy, a pain this invisible. "Why were you out there alone?" he asked softly, hoping for even a fragment of a clue to help piece together the mystery surrounding her. I, I don't know," Isabella whispered weakly. "Someone took me and left me in the rain." A chill swept through the room, crawling up Daniel's spine like ice. This wasn't a case of a lost child. This was something far more sinister, something real and dangerous, hiding behind the eerie silence of this little girl. He gently took her cold hand in his. His voice was barely more than a breath, but it carried the weight of a promise he never imagined he'd make. "You don't have to remember right now. You've got me and Ryan now, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Just as those words left his lips, a flash of lightning lit up the window, followed by the sudden, jarring ring of the telephone. Both of them jumped. Daniel looked at the screen, a number he didn't recognize, glowing clear and sharp. In that split second, he knew. Whatever past Isabella couldn't remember. It was coming for her, and it wasn't coming quietly. A terrifying truth was about to surface, pulling them all into a storm far greater than the one outside. Scarlett Monroe jolted awake in the sterile white room of Willow General Hospital, her head spinning like she had just escaped a long, exhausting dream. Her hand instinctively reached out, searching for her daughter, but the cold emptiness of the bed beside her made her heart pound in panic. Isabella was gone. "Where's Isabella?" Scarlett gasped, her voice catching in her throat. A nearby nurse rushed over, her eyes filled with a mixture of hesitation and pity. Scarlett didn't need to hear more. She already knew something terrible had happened. The room seemed to close in on her, choking the air from her lungs as the nurse whispered, "There was no child at the scene when the ambulance arrived." In that instant, Scarlett knew the crash hadn't been an accident. Chaotic memories came flooding back. Blinding headlights, the screech of tires, and then her daughter's small figure disappearing into the night. A horrifying truth began to unravel. This was all part of a plan crafted by her father, Samuel Tate. She had always believed her father cared only for power and wealth, but now it was painfully clear. Samuel would use anyone, even his own blood, to get what he wanted. Whatever fragile trust had once existed between them had long since shattered. All that remained was suspicion and the slow-burning fury rising inside her. Her fingers dug into the bedsheet, the helplessness and rage surging through her veins. But those emotions quickly gave way to something stronger, an unshakable resolve. Scarlett knew she couldn't lose Isabella, no matter what it took, even if it meant standing against her own flesh and blood. She drew in a deep breath. Her eyes hardened, cold as steel, sharp with purpose. "I'll find the truth, and I'll bring Isabella home," she whispered to herself, ready to walk straight into the fire ahead. This wasn't just a fight for her daughter. It was a fight to reclaim herself. Lucas Griffin stood by the window, phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice cold and composed. "Yes, Mr. Tate, I'll make sure this never gets out." But the moment he turned around, Scarlett Monroe was already there, eyes like ice, brimming with heartbreak and a deep, searing disappointment. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice cut through the room with such precision that it made Lucas flinch. "What are you hiding from me, Lucas?" He hesitated for a second, but quickly recovered with the practiced calm of someone used to concealing the truth. "It's just a few minor complications, Scarlett. Nothing serious." She stepped closer, locking eyes with him, as if searching for the last shred of conscience in the man she once trusted with everything. "That's my daughter, Lucas. Isabella is not a minor complication. I want the truth, right now." The silence in the room turned suffocating, as if the air itself had been drained away. Lucas lowered his gaze, unable to meet hers, and that tiny act of avoidance said more than any confession ever could. Scarlett saw it clearly now. She was no longer safe, and she could no longer afford to trust anyone but herself. The unconditional love she held for Isabella ignited something inside her, a decision she'd never dared to make until now. It was time to break free from the cruel grip of her father, to face the darkness Samuel Tate had carefully built around them. She packed quickly. The luxurious items scattered around the room now meant nothing, just hollow reminders of the gilded cage she'd been kept in. Without a word, she walked out, each step steady with resolve. In her chest beat a heart full of determination, and a fragile spark of hope lighting the way ahead. Scarlett knew this wasn't just about finding her daughter anymore. It was about finding herself again, in a journey that would be dangerous, uncertain, but burning bright with love and unshakable faith. Scarlett stepped slowly onto the porch of the small house by the Gray Shore Harbor, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. The moment her eyes fell on Isabella, curled up in the corner of the living room, wide-eyed and wary, her fragile hope collided with a deep, aching pain. Her daughter was afraid of her own mother. "Isabella, it's me, sweetheart," Scarlett whispered, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. Isabella didn't move. Her gaze flicked quickly to Daniel, as if searching for permission, for reassurance. And in that single moment, Scarlett felt an invisible knife twist deep in her chest. To see her child, her only child, seek comfort from a stranger instead of her, it was almost too much to bear. Daniel stepped forward, gently resting a hand on Isabella's shoulder. His voice was soft, steady. "She's your mom, sweetheart," he said, trying to ease the fear trembling in the girl's eyes. Isabella glanced up at Scarlett, suspicion still clouding her small face. Scarlett knelt a little lower, her voice thick with sorrow and fierce determination. "No one will ever hurt you again, Isabella. I promise." But then came a whisper, quiet, delicate, and devastating. "I don't want to go back there. You couldn't protect me." The words struck Scarlett like a lightning bolt straight to the soul. She had known, deep down, that her choices, her silence, had left scars. But hearing it from her daughter's lips shattered something inside her. Slowly, Scarlett dropped to her knees and opened her arms wide, her eyes pleading. "I know, baby. I know I failed you. But I'm not taking you back there. Not ever. Please, just give me one more chance." The room fell still, the tension thick but slowly fading. And then, hesitantly, almost imperceptibly, Isabella reached out her small hand. A fragile, uncertain gesture. But it was enough. It was the first step toward healing, toward finding their way back to each other, one heartbeat at a time. Outside the small harbor house in Gray Shore, the darkness settled like a threat. Agent Connor Hayes sat motionless in the front seat of a sleek black car, his eyes sharp and cold as they locked onto the house ahead. His breathing was calm, steady, as if he were preparing for a calculated, merciless hunt. The order from Samuel Tate had been crystal clear. No matter what, Isabella must be brought back. Inside, Scarlett clutched Isabella's hand tightly, her heart pounding with a growing sense of dread. Daniel stood by the window, eyes narrowed on the suspicious cars that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The tension in his expression said it all. He'd seen danger before, and this was it. "They're here," he whispered, his voice calm but charged with warning. Then the phone rang, sharp, jarring, slicing through the heavy silence. Scarlett glanced at the screen. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then answered, her breath catching as the familiar ice-cold voice of her father filled the line. "Scarlett, did you really think you could run from me?" Before she could respond, the front door shook violently, a sound that sent chills down her spine. The agents were here. Connor Hayes' voice rang out from the other side, calm and chilling. "Scarlett, open the door. We just want to take Isabella back to where she belongs." Scarlett pulled Isabella closer, holding her tight. Panic clawed at her chest, but it was quickly replaced by something fiercer. Resolve. Looking into her daughter's terrified eyes, Scarlett felt something ignite. She couldn't let Isabella be dragged back into the cold, controlled world Samuel had built. Not again. She turned to Daniel, her grip tightening on his hand. Her eyes burned with urgency, desperation, and an unwavering determination. "We have to go, now!" Daniel didn't hesitate. He led them quickly toward the back, where the night loomed, dangerous, uncertain, but laced with a glimmer of fragile hope. Together they disappeared into the shadows, running not just for safety, but for love, for freedom, for a future that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to steal. Daniel's battered old truck tore down the winding, treacherous road of Eagle Pass, tires gripping the wet pavement with desperation. The night sky hung like a curtain of ink, and thick fog rolled in waves across the cliffs, as if nature itself was trying to shield them from the cold, piercing headlights growing closer behind. Scarlett sat in the passenger seat, her fingers wrapped tightly around Isabella's tiny hand, feeling the trembling pulse of fear in her daughter's frozen grip. "Daniel, they're catching up," Scarlett said, her voice tight, trembling, as if the fear in her chest had reached her throat and refused to let go. He shot a glance at the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched as the dark shapes of their pursuers grew larger, nearer. In that instant, Daniel knew that choosing to stand by Scarlett hadn't just been about protecting an innocent child. It had become something deeper, a way to redeem the fractured pieces of his own scarred soul. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the night like a whip. The sharp report sliced through the air, and Isabella let out a terrified scream. The truck jolted as the back tires skidded, the vehicle swerving wildly. Daniel gripped the wheel with everything he had, his heart slamming against his ribs like it was trying to tear its way out. "Hold on to Isabella," he shouted, eyes locked on Scarlett, filled with a fierce urgency. And in that moment, amid chaos and fear, Scarlett felt it. A bond, unshakable and absolute, forming between them. A trust born not from time, but from truth. Daniel veered hard, jerking the wheel toward a narrow side road barely wide enough for the truck. The vehicle tilted dangerously, skimming the edge of a steep drop that fell into a black abyss. Behind them, tires screeched, headlights flared. Closer, louder, more relentless. Scarlett clutched Isabella tightly, her eyes shut as she whispered a silent prayer for a miracle. Then out of nowhere, the sound of skidding tires behind them, brakes squealing in panic. A landslide. The road behind them had given way, forcing the pursuing cars to screech to a halt at the edge of the collapse. Daniel exhaled shakily, knuckles white on the steering wheel. They'd escaped, barely. But none of them were under any illusions. This was only the beginning. What lay ahead would test their courage, their love, and the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in the face of fear. At the summit of Eagle Pass, beneath the pale moonlight slicing through the jagged mountain peaks, Scarlett stood alone at the edge of a steep cliff. The wind howled around her in sharp gusts, but the cold she felt wasn't from the wind. It came from the invisible wounds left by the man who had once meant the world to her. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the call button, her heart pounding like a warning bell. The voice on the other end came through deep and powerful, unmistakable. "Scarlett, are you really ready to go to war with your own father?" She drew in a steadying breath, forcing the storm inside her to still. "Listen to me carefully, Dad. If you don't call off the hunt for Isabella right now, I will release everything. All the files, the dark deals, the political manipulation, every unforgivable thing you've buried. I'm not bluffing." Silence fell. Scarlett could hear the slow, angry breathing on the other end. She knew Samuel Tate wasn't a man who took threats lightly. He didn't tolerate betrayal, and he never surrendered without a fight. But this wasn't about power anymore. This was about a child's heart, about the unconditional love Scarlett carried for her daughter. Finally, his voice returned, low and bitter, each word forced through clenched teeth. "Do you even understand what you're doing, Scarlett? You're destroying everything I built." Scarlett's lips curved into a faint smile, one that carried both sorrow and release. "Maybe I am, Dad, but at least I won't lose what matters most. The choice is yours. End this now, or watch your empire unravel in front of the whole world." There was a pause, heavy and suffocating. Then came a long, weary exhale. And for the first time, Scarlett heard something she never expected: reluctant surrender. "Fine," Samuel said quietly. "You win. But remember this: the price of winning is never cheap." She ended the call, the weight she'd carried for so long suddenly lifting from her shoulders. As she turned back toward Daniel and Isabella waiting nearby, her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with hope. Their new life, free, unknown, and finally their own, was just beginning. The soft rays of morning light slipped gently through the window pane of the newly built Pierce Auto Repair, nestled in the heart of Grayshore. A warm golden glow bathed the room, as if the sun itself was offering a quiet welcome to three souls who had weathered the fiercest storms life could bring. Daniel set down his tools carefully on the workbench, his eyes lingering on Scarlett and Isabella as they decorated the front window with small, colorful flower pots. This wasn't a chance meeting of strangers anymore. This, this was a family, not bound by blood, but by something far stronger. Love and the invisible threads of connection that had pulled them together. Scarlett met Daniel's gaze and offered a soft, knowing smile. After all the chases, the dangers, the nights gripped with fear, they had found this simple peace, honest joy. Isabella's laughter echoed through the space, light and free, as if sorrow had never touched her life at all. Suddenly, an old passenger van rumbled slowly into the garage. A man stepped out hesitantly, his posture uncertain as he approached, holding a worn envelope tightly in one hand. I'm looking for Daniel Pierce?" the man asked, his voice unsteady. Daniel nodded, curious. The man held out the letter, bowing his head slightly. "Samuel Tate asked me to deliver this to you." Scarlett felt a chill at the mention of the name, but she stepped closer, gently resting her hand on Daniel's shoulder. A quiet reminder that they no longer had anything to fear. Daniel opened the envelope. The words were few, but they landed like thunder. "I'm sorry, I'm done. Please take good care of my granddaughter." Scarlett stood frozen, her breath catching as the weight of those final words settled over her. Samuel, the powerful, unyielding man who had once tried to control everything, had finally understood that love, not dominance, was the only thing worth leaving behind. Isabella came bounding over, slipping her small hands into hers and Daniel's. She looked up at them with bright eyes, full of trust, full of hope. And in that quiet, golden moment, they all knew. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of the happiness they had fought so hard to find. The soft chime of the school bus echoed through the crisp morning air of Grayshore. Isabella stood at the gates of her new school, Grayshore Elementary, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack, eyes following the cheerful crowd of children streaming through the entrance. A light breeze danced through her brown hair, and though the feeling was unfamiliar, it no longer carried the weight of fear. Scarlett and Daniel stood a few steps behind, silently watching their daughter. It was Isabella's first day back at school since everything, the disappearance, the desperate flight, the tearful battle for the simple right to live freely. Neither of them spoke, but in their hearts, the same emotion pulsed quietly, hope rising again. Isabella turned back. Her clear eyes met her mother's, and Scarlett smiled softly, lifting a hand in a gentle wave. Daniel nodded, pride shimmering in his gaze. In that brief, beautiful moment, without a single word exchanged, Isabella knew this was home. But life always has a way of testing the peace we dare to believe in. When school let out, Isabella emerged hand in hand with a new friend, Mira. She was laughing, bright and carefree, until her eyes caught something across the street. A man, a stranger. His gaze lingered on Isabella just a second too long before he turned away, slipping out of sight as Daniel approached. Tension crept in, quiet but undeniable. Daniel's brow furrowed, instincts sharpened. Scarlett, standing nearby, took Isabella's backpack and noticed something strange. In the small side pocket, a piece of paper, folded neatly, almost deliberately. Her fingers unfolded it. "Be careful, this isn't over." The joy of the morning didn't vanish, but it shifted, its fragility now visible. And yet they didn't flinch, because now they understood. Love isn't just warmth and light, it's courage. And this family, built from heartbreak, held together by faith, was ready to protect each other, to fight if they had to, because they hadn't just survived the storm, they were building something real, day by day, out of love. On a gentle slope overlooking the sea at Grayshore, a modest wooden house stood quietly beneath the golden haze of the setting sun, its porch bathed in soft amber light and salt-kissed breezes. Here, far from the golden mansions and power-drenched spotlights she once called home, Scarlett Monroe knelt beside her daughter, a warm smile on her lips as they planted the very first rows of flowers in the backyard soil. From the garage, Daniel emerged, grease-stained rag in hand, but his eyes, clear and steady, held the peace of this new chapter. It was the same look he wore the day they stopped running. Scarlett had let go of the diamond-encrusted phone, the limitless credit cards, and the endless string of high society galas. In their place, she had chosen something rare, something once lost and now deeply found: family. Isabella was no longer the frightened child hiding in the corners of a hospital room. She laughed now, freely. She dreamed sweet, small dreams, and they were enough. Enough to mend the heart that had once been shattered. And Daniel, the man who once lived in the shadow of his past, had built a home not with wealth, but with kindness, with every quiet act of courage, with every choice that said, "Love is worth more than fear." As night fell, the three of them sat beneath twinkling lights strung across the porch, mugs of warm cocoa in hand, laughter echoing into the night. There was no fairy tale ending, only something deeper, something real. Sometimes it turns out loss is the doorway to a second chance, if we're brave enough to believe and loving enough to take it. Do you believe that family isn't about blood, but about love? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're always here to listen. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next heartwarming story, where love always finds its way home. Some journeys begin in the heart of a storm, but end with the warmth of a home. The story of Scarlett Monroe, Daniel Pierce, and little Isabella Lane isn't just a series of gripping, breathless twists. It's a quiet but powerful reminder. Sometimes what we think is loss is really the doorway to something far more miraculous. Scarlett once lived high above the world, surrounded by status and acclaim. Yet she lost the one thing that truly mattered: her daughter. Daniel, a quiet, humble man, believed his world would never extend beyond his small garage and his son. And Isabella, a child the world seemed to forget, became the bridge that brought three strangers together and made them a family. What's most precious doesn't come from wealth or power. It comes from the courage to love, to let go, to forgive. Scarlett gave up everything to win her daughter back. Daniel didn't hesitate to protect a woman with more secrets than answers. And Isabella, through her clear, searching eyes, gave them both the trust they needed to begin again. The greatest lesson this story leaves behind: family isn't where we're born, it's where we're chosen to stay. It's the people who choose to walk through pain with you and help you heal. And who knows, maybe the moment you reach out and help someone through their storm, you might just find yourself too.